In a city built on the bones of the silent, the most dangerous people aren't the ones screaming for power. They're the ones who have already won it. The Incheon back alleys weren't just transit routes for the poor. They were the veins of a subterranean kingdom disguised as urban decay. Here, beneath the flickering neon of cheap noodle shops, kingmakers traded lives for territory. Shadowy directors laundered their morality behind rusted fire escapes, and men like Baek Sung-il came to be reminded that their thrones were built on concrete and cold steel. Standing in the drenching rain, Sung-il looked like a relic of a dying era. To the public scrolling through headlines about his shipping conglomerate, he was the Ghost of Seoul, the visionary who turned the port's chaos into a global trade monopoly. They saw the bespoke suits and the jawline carved from iron and legacy. They didn't see the 15 blades currently circling him, or the fact that for the man who transformed violence into venture capital, the debt of the past had finally come to collect. Welcome back to Stories with Ross, besties. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video. Hit subscribe and comment where you're watching from. Now let's get into it. The strongest man in Seoul was ready to die. For 20 years, I had outrun the Reaper by being faster, colder, and more ruthless than the men sent to replace me. But in this narrow Incheon alley, the math had finally run out. The rain was a relentless weight, washing the blood from my tailored suit into the oil-slicked gutters. 15 blades caught the flicker of broken neon, circling me like a pack of wolves that had finally cornered a weary lion. I leaned my back against the cold brick wall, my lungs burning with the metallic tang of ozone and exhaustion. My vision was blurring, the faces of my assassins contorting into a singular, murderous mask of greed. I closed my eyes, bracing for the final rush, accepting that the Ghost of Seoul would end as a nameless stain on the pavement. Then, I felt it, a small, warm hand gripping my bloodied thumb. I opened my eyes to see a 7-year-old girl in a soaked cardigan standing directly in my shadow. She was small enough to be crushed by a single stray blow, yet she stood with a haunting, preternatural calm that froze the air more than the winter rain ever could. She didn't look at me with pity. She looked at the 15 men with a clinical, detached observation. The lead assassin laughed, a jagged sound that died in his throat as the girl reached into her pocket. She didn't pull out a knife or a gun. She held a piece of discarded junk, a pressurized canister she had jury-rigged with the precision of a master clockmaker. "He's not done yet," she said. Her voice was tiny, but it carried a weight that silenced the storm. Before the men could move, she triggered the device. A deafening roar of chemical light and blinding white pressure erupted between us and the mob, a wall of fire and gas that screamed through the claustrophobic space. In the sudden, white-hot chaos, the wolves scattered, clutching their blinded eyes. The girl didn't flinch. She simply looked up at me, her eyes reflecting the orange glow of the explosion, and jerked my hand toward the darkness of the sewer grate. The strongest man in Seoul had been saved by a child who saw the end and refused to let it happen. As we slipped into the shadows, the shock of her intervention was eclipsed by a single, terrifying thought. I had spent my life building an empire of monsters, but I had never seen anything as dangerous as the little girl holding my hand. The Incheon air was thick with the scent of wet asphalt and impending death. I stood at the dead end of a narrow vein of the city, my breath coming in ragged, shallow hitches that bloomed like ghosts in the freezing rain. My bespoke suit, once a symbol of untouchable status, was shredded and heavy with a mixture of rainwater and my own blood. I could feel the cold brick of the warehouse pressing against my spine, a hard reminder that the Ghost of Seoul had finally run out of room to vanish. Before me, 15 shadows detached themselves from the downpour. They didn't move like common thugs. They moved with the rhythmic, terrifying grace of professionals. The death squad, sent to ensure my empire ended in the gutter. The light from a flickering neon sign above a closed noodle shop cast jagged red strobes across their faces, reflecting off the steel of 15 unsheathed blades. There was no dialogue, no cinematic monologue. There was only the sound of heavy boots splashing in oil-slicked puddles and the rhythmic shick of knives ready to find their home in my chest. I was the visionary who had transformed the port's chaos into a global monopoly. Yet here I was, reduced to a dying animal in a cage of brick and rain. My hand went to my side, fingers clutching a wound that leaked my life into the pavement. I closed my eyes for a heartbeat, bracing for the final rush, ready to let the darkness take the man the world feared. Then, the air changed. The heavy footsteps stuttered. A small, rhythmic splashing, lighter than the boots of the assassins, broke the tension. I opened my eyes to see a sliver of blue light cutting through the gloom. A young girl, no older than 7, stepped into the center of the kill zone. She wore a simple, soaked cardigan that clung to her small frame, her hair plastered to her forehead by the storm. She didn't look frightened. She didn't look like she belonged in a world of blades and betrayals. She stood directly in front of me, her tiny shadow stretching toward the men who meant to kill me. She looked at the lead assassin, her eyes hauntingly calm, and reached into the pocket of her sweater. In that moment, the hopeless atmosphere of the alley fractured. The wolves paused, confused by the lamb that had walked into their midst, unaware that the girl in the rain was the only thing in Seoul more dangerous than the men they served. The lead assassin took a step forward, his blade carving a silver arc through the curtain of rain. But Melissa didn't flinch, while the death squad hesitated, gripped by the absurdity of a child standing in their kill zone. Her small fingers worked with a frantic, mechanical grace inside her cardigan pocket. She pulled out what looked like a discarded pressurized canister, wrapped in a mess of copper wire and a cracked digital watch face. A piece of junk that pulsated with a faint, rhythmic hum. "Back," she whispered, her voice a sharp contrast to the thunder rolling over the Incheon skyline. Before the lead man could register the threat, she slammed a makeshift trigger. There was no fuse, no countdown. An ear-shattering roar erupted from the small device, unleashing a violent torrent of pressurized chemical flame and blinding white phosphorus. The toy didn't just burn. It breathed fire, creating a wall of incandescent heat that turned the freezing rain into a scalding mist. The alley transformed into a screaming furnace. The 15 assassins, caught in the sudden whiteout, clutched their eyes as the chemical bloom seared through the darkness. The smell of ozone and burning fuel choked the air, masking the copper scent of my own blood. In the center of the chaos, Melissa remained an island of terrifying focus. She didn't watch the men fall. She reached back and grabbed my bloodied hand, her grip surprisingly strong for a frame so small. "The grate," she commanded, pulling me toward a heavy iron cover slick with oil and runoff. My legs felt like lead, my vision swimming from the loss of blood, but the heat at our backs forced a final surge of adrenaline. With a grunt of agonizing effort, I helped her heave the iron lid aside. We didn't climb down. We dropped into the yawning black throat of the city's drainage system, just as the first of the assassins managed to fire blindly into the smoke. The world of neon and blades vanished, replaced by the hollow, echoing roar of rushing water and the thick smell of damp earth. We waded through the knee-deep surge of the sewers, the light from the alley above fading into a pinprick of white before disappearing entirely. In the absolute dark, the only thing that felt real was the small, steady hand guiding a dying giant through the labyrinth. I had spent my life as the Ghost of Seoul, but as we vanished into the bowels of the city, I realized I was being led by something far more spectral and infinitely more dangerous. The sanctuary was a place that didn't exist on any map, a bunker of cold concrete and high-end surveillance buried beneath an abandoned textile factory in the city's industrial gut. The air inside was filtered and sterile, a sharp contrast to the sewage and rot we had left behind. I collapsed into a heavy leather chair, the movement tearing a fresh groan from my lungs as I fumbled for the medical kit. My vision pulsed in time with the throb of my side, red and black waves threatening to pull me under. Melissa didn't ask if I was okay. She didn't cry or tremble. While I stitched my skin with trembling hands, she moved through the room with a silent, predatory efficiency. She wasn't exploring. She was surveying. I watched her through the haze of pain, expecting the curiosity of a child, but her eyes were different. She stared at the bank of monitors, 16 screens flickering with the blue light feeds of every exit and perimeter sensor, and she wasn't just looking at the pictures. She was counting. I saw her lips move in a voiceless rhythm, her gaze snapping from the frame rates to the sensor logs, then to the layout of the weapons locker. She wasn't speaking to me or even to herself. She was calculating. She was measuring the thickness of the steel door, the interval of the camera sweeps, and the weight of the handguns mounted on the wall. It was the look of a grandmaster evaluating a board, or a prisoner mapping the flaws in a cage. "There's bread in the kitchen," I rasped, my voice sounding like gravel under a boot. "And water." She didn't turn. She merely nodded, her eyes fixed on a screen showing the thermal signature of the alleyway entrance 3 floors above. She adjusted a dial on the console, a piece of hardware she should have had no knowledge of, optimizing the refresh rate to eliminate a ghost glitch in the feed. A cold shiver that had nothing to do with my blood loss climbed my spine. I had taken her in because I owed her my life, thinking I was protecting a victim of a cruel world. But as I watched her fingers dance over the encrypted keyboard, I realized Melissa wasn't looking for a guardian. She was looking for a fortress. She didn't have the eyes of an orphan. She had the eyes of a weapon that had finally found its way back to an armory. I was the Ghost of Seoul, a man who lived in the shadows of empires, yet for the first time in my life, I felt like the most visible thing in the room. The sterile white light of the safehouse's medical bay felt like a jagged blade against my eyes. I sat on the edge of a steel gurney, watching Dr. Han, the only man in the city who could sew up a mafia boss without asking questions, run a handheld scanner over Melissa's neck. She sat perfectly still, her small hands resting on her knees, her eyes fixed on a point in the middle distance that only she could see. The scanner emitted a sharp, dissonant beep. Han's face, usually a mask of professional indifference, went pale. "It's not just a tag, Sung-il," he whispered, stepping back as if the girl were made of glass. "It's a high-frequency subdermal transmitter. It's a tracking chip, but it's linked to a biological monitor. It's built to harvest data." He turned the screen toward me. Beneath the fine, pale skin of her nape, a microscopic barcode shimmered in the infrared light, etched with a serial number that felt like a punch to my gut. Subject 0, Foundry Logistics. The room seemed to tilt. The name Foundry didn't just belong to a shadowy government agency. It was a ghost subsidiary of my own shipping conglomerate, a shell company I had personally authorized 3 years ago to modernize human trafficking routes under the guise of high-tech logistics. I had signed the papers. I had funded the research. I had built the cage she had escaped from. The blood on my hands suddenly felt cold, a stain that reached back years into my own ledger. I looked at Melissa, this child who had stood between me and 15 blades, and realized the cruel geometry of our meeting. She wasn't an orphan I had found. She was a product I had manufactured. I had spent my life believing I was a predator who only hunted other wolves, but the barcode on her neck was a receipt for my own soul. She hadn't just saved a king. She had saved the man who had authorized her creation as a weapon. Melissa finally turned her head, her calm, calculating eyes meeting mine, and for the first time, I saw the truth reflected there. She knew. She had always known. I was the Ghost of Seoul, the visionary who transformed violence into venture capital, and I had unknowingly spent a fortune to build a hell for the only person who had ever shown me mercy. The heavy scent of antiseptic in the medical bay was quickly replaced by the smell of expensive tobacco and impending rain as I stepped into the boardroom of my penthouse. My top lieutenants were already there, gathered around the mahogany table like vultures waiting for a carcass to stop twitching. They looked at my bandaged side and my tattered clothes with a hunger they couldn't quite hide. Executive O, my second-in-command, sat at the far end, his hands folded with a piety that made my skin crawl. "We heard the news, boss," O said, his voice a smooth, practiced lie. "The Incheon hit was a tragedy. We were prepared to negotiate for your return, and for the girl. The Foundry is offering a full pardon for our organization if she is delivered by midnight." I looked at the men I had raised, the empire I had built on a foundation of modernized logistics and cold efficiency. They weren't looking at me as their leader. They were looking at me as a hurdle between them and a lucrative peace treaty with the government's darkest shadows. They wanted to trade a 7-year-old girl for a seat at the table I had built. I didn't sit down. I walked to the head of the table, my hand resting on the matte black grip of the pistol tucked into my waistband. "I signed the authorization for the foundry," I said, my voice a low, lethal hum that silenced the room. "I built the routes. I paid for the research. And tonight, I realized that I am the architect of a world that doesn't deserve to exist." O's brow furrowed. "Sung-il, be reasonable. She's an asset, a weapon. Returning her is just good business." "She isn't an asset," I replied, the image of the barcode on Melissa's neck burning in my mind. "She is the mirror, and I don't like what I see." The first shot took Executive O directly between the eyes before he could reach for the panic button. The silence that followed was a vacuum, broken only by the sharp, rhythmic cracks of my firearm as I moved around the table. I didn't feel the heat of the muzzle or the recoil in my arm. I only felt the weight of the cleansing of the house. These men were the pillars of my empire, the ones who had executed the orders that led to Melissa's creation. One by one, they slumped against the mahogany, their blood staining the very ledgers they had used to calculate her value. In 3 minutes, the Ghost of Seoul had decapitated his own organization. I stood in the center of the carnage, the room echoing with the hollow ring of empty shells hitting the floor. I wasn't choosing peace. I was choosing war, a war against my own legacy, against the foundry, and against every monster I had helped create. I walked out of the penthouse, leaving the crown in the dirt, and headed back to the girl who had taught a killer how to burn his world down. The penthouse was silent, the air still vibrating with the violence of the cleansing. I returned to the sub-level safe house, my hands scrubbed clean of my lieutenant's blood, though the scent of gunpowder clung to my skin like a second shadow. Melissa was sitting on the edge of a cot, her small frame dwarfed by the industrial concrete walls. She wasn't calculating now. She was staring at a frayed picture book I had scavenged from a supply crate, her thumb tracing the illustration of a dragon. I sat on the floor across from her, the distance between us a chasm of my own making. "The monsters in those stories," I rasped, my voice sounding hollow in the sterile room. "They always lose in the end." I expected silence. I expected the cold, analytical gaze that had mapped my security systems. Instead, she closed the book and looked directly at me. Her eyes weren't haunting or hollow. They were impossibly old. "The dragon wasn't a monster," she said. The sound of her voice stopped my heart. It was soft, a melodic whisper that carried the weight of 1,000 secrets. Her first words spoken to the man who had built her cage. "He was just a guardian who forgot how to be soft," she continued, her gaze dropping to the bandages on my side. "He burned the world because he didn't know how to save it." I looked at my hands, the hands that had signed the foundry's contracts and pulled the trigger on my own family. "I'm the dragon, Melissa," I whispered, the admission a jagged piece of glass in my throat. "No," she said, standing up and crossing the small space between us. She placed her hand on my forehead, her touch cooling the fever of my guilt. "The dragon is dead. You're just the man who stayed behind." In that quiet, subterranean moment, the bond was sealed. I wasn't just her protector, and she wasn't just my asset. We were two ghosts haunting the ruins of a broken empire, bound by a history of blood and a sudden, terrifying hope. I realized then that I wouldn't just fight for her. I would burn every bridge I had ever built to ensure she never had to be Subject Zero again. The stillness of the safe house shattered not with a bang, but with a sudden, oppressive silence as the exterior thermal feeds flickered and died. On the monitors, the blue light glow of the perimeter sensors flatlined into a static hum. The foundry's tactical team didn't announce their arrival. They moved like a scalpel, cutting through the shadows of the textile factory above with government-backed precision. "Stay behind the secondary bulkhead," I commanded, my voice dropping into the low, vibrationless frequency of a man who had already accepted his own end. Melissa didn't argue. She moved into the reinforced alcove, her eyes reflecting the crimson emergency lights that now bathed the concrete walls in the color of a fresh wound. Then, the ceiling breathed fire. The foundry didn't use the doors. They used shaped charges to breach the concrete slab directly above the armory. For figures in matte black ceramic armor descended on fast ropes, their movements mechanical, their suppressed rifles spitting jagged bursts of muzzle flash. These weren't the street thugs from the Incheon alley. These were the architects of Melissa's nightmare, the men sent to reclaim the subject I had helped fund. I met them with a fury that felt ancient and absolute. In the past, I had fought for territory, for pride, or for the cold logic of an asset. Now, I fought for the girl who had called a dragon a guardian. I didn't hide behind cover. I moved through the crossfire like a ghost that refused to haunt, my pistol barking rhythmically as I closed the distance. I took a round to the shoulder, the impact spinning me, but the pain was a distant secondary concern. I caught the lead operative's throat, my fingers finding the gap in his armor, and slammed him into the steel locker with a force that buckled the metal. I wasn't just defending a safe house. I was tearing down the walls of the cage I had spent 3 years building. As the last operative fell, the room grew heavy with the smell of cordite and ozone. My vision swirled, the red emergency lights blending with the actual blood pooling at my feet. I looked toward the alcove. Melissa was there, her face a mask of terrifying calm as she watched me through the smoke. She didn't look at the bodies. She looked at the man who had stayed behind, and I realized that the foundry's shadow was long, but it could no longer reach her as long as I breathed. The digital humming of the safehouse server was the only heartbeat left in a world that had become a graveyard. I sat before the console, my blood dripping onto the glowing keys, each droplet a crimson period at the end of a long, dark sentence. The foundry wasn't just a government project. It was a parasite that lived inside the ribcage of my empire. As long as the Ghost of Seoul had a throne, they had a place to hide. As long as my accounts remained active, Melissa remained a piece of inventory they could eventually track. To save her, I couldn't just kill the men they sent. I had to kill the idea of myself. My fingers, stiff with cold and trauma, began to dance across the encrypted interface. This wasn't a hack. It was an execution. I opened the backdoors I had designed for my own leverage and began the scorched earth protocol. I initiated a cascade of high-frequency trades designed to tank the stock of my shipping conglomerate, watching in real time as billions of dollars in market cap evaporated into the digital ether. I didn't stop at the money. I began uploading the hidden ledgers, the real ones. Every bribed port official, every offshore shell company used by the foundry, and every secret contract I had signed was being pushed to the servers of every major news outlet and international regulator simultaneously. I was burning the throne I had spent 20 years building, turning my legacy into a funeral pyre that would illuminate the darkest corners of the city. Melissa stood by the doorway, her small frame silhouetted by the blue glare of the monitors. She didn't ask what I was doing. She understood the weight of the silence that followed each enter key. I was making myself a pariah. I was ensuring that when the sun rose, there would be no empire left to inherit, no board of directors to serve, and no place for a monster to call home. "It's done?" I whispered, the words feeling lighter than anything I had said in years. The screens began to flicker red as the self-destruct commands reached the local hardware. In the distance, I could almost hear the sirens of a world waking up to the scandal of the century. I looked at Melissa and saw not a subject, but a future. By destroying my past, I was finally clearing a path for her to walk. The ghost was fading, and in the ashes of the throne, only the guardian remained. The sky over Pier 7 didn't just rain. It wept a deluge of iron-gray water that blurred the line between the sea and the concrete. The cargo ship groaned against its moorings, a massive, rusting leviathan preparing to slip into the fog of the international channel. I stood at the foot of the gangplank, the salt air stinging the fresh wounds on my chest, my hand trembling as I pressed a burner phone and a thick envelope of untraceable documents into Melissa's small hands. "Go," I said, the word barely a whisper against the roar of the storm. "Don't look back. The captain is paid. You'll be a ghost among ghosts until you find the shore." Melissa didn't cry. She reached out, her tiny fingers brushing the bloodied knuckles of my hand, the hand that had built her cage and then burned the world to break it. "The dragon stays," she said, her eyes searching mine with a clarity that broke what was left of my heart. "The dragon is finished?" I replied, a ghost of a smile touching my lips. He's finally exactly where he needs to be. I watched her disappear into the steel maw of the ship, and then I turned back to the pier. The headlights of 20 sedans cut through the downpour, a wall of blinding light that signaled the arrival of the remains of my empire. The board, the foundry, and the mercenaries who hadn't yet heard that the money was gone. They were all there, a tide of vengeful shadows coming to reclaim their prize. I stepped into the center of the pier, my silhouette framed by the looming ship. I didn't have an army. I didn't have a throne. I only had 2 pistols and a soul that had finally stopped feeling like stone. As the mob spilled out of the cars, weapons drawn, I became the shield I had never had as a boy in these same streets. The first wave hit like a physical weight, muzzle flashes illuminating the rain in jagged, electric pulses. I fought with a terrifying, rhythmic focus, every shot a penance, every movement a wall between the wolves and the girl on the ship. I was hit, once, twice, but the pain was an anchor, keeping me grounded in the only moment of my life that truly mattered. As the ship's horn let out a final, mournful blast and the gap between the pier and the hull began to widen, I fell to one knee. My vision was a wash of red and gray, the world fading into the sound of the waves. I looked up one last time, seeing the ship vanish into the mist, and I knew she was gone. The Ghost of Seoul was dead, but the man who stayed behind had finally won. Here are some lessons to learn from the story. The legend of Baek Sung-il and Melissa offers a profound exploration of redemption through destruction. The central moral lesson is that true atonement often requires more than a change of heart. It demands the absolute dismantling of the systems that allowed the original sins to occur. Sung-il didn't just save a child. He set fire to the throne that had sustained his life of violence, proving that one cannot truly protect the innocent while still profiting from their logistics. Furthermore, the story emphasizes the agency of the unseen. Melissa, as Subject Zero, was designed to be a passive asset, yet her intervention in the alleyway flipped the narrative. It suggests that even those marginalized by power, children, victims, or the invisible, possess the capacity to fundamentally alter the course of history when they choose to look at the world with clarity rather than fear. Finally, the bond between the two serves as a reminder of the dragon's burden. It teaches that strength finds its highest purpose not in conquest, but in becoming a shield for another. Sung-il's final stand was his only moment of true freedom, demonstrating that a legacy is not measured by what one leaves behind in a bank account, but by the safety of the person who gets to walk away.